And somehow that small decision felt bigger than anything he had ever done before. "I think," Carl said carefully, "I made the right choice today." Morgan studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "Maybe you did." Carl exhaled, but the moment of relief was short-lived, because Morgan's next words sent a chill down his spine. "But one good choice doesn't erase 100 bad ones. Let's see if you can keep proving yourself." Carl had passed one test, but was he truly changed, or was this just temporary? Morgan wasn't done watching, and the biggest test was yet to come. Carl had spent years believing that authority came from control, that respect was something demanded, not earned, that kindness was a luxury, not a necessity. But standing there, looking at the cafe, his cafe, thriving in a way it never had before, he understood something. He had been wrong. Respect wasn't about power. It wasn't about making people afraid. It was about lifting them up. And that realization, it changed everything. Months had passed since Morgan Freeman had first walked through the cafe's doors. The business had changed. The customers had changed. And Carl had changed too. He no longer ruled with fear. He led with understanding. There were still days when old habits tried to creep back in, when he felt the urge to snap, to dismiss, to return to the man he used to be. But then he would look around, at the employees who now worked with confidence, at the customers who felt welcome, not judged. And at John, the old man he had once ignored, now a regular customer, treated with dignity. It wasn't a perfect redemption, but it was real. And Morgan, he had seen enough. "You proved me wrong, Carl," Morgan said one evening as they stood near the counter. Carl glanced at him, expecting another test, another challenge, but instead, Morgan simply extended his hand. "You earned your place here." Carl stared at the offered handshake for a moment. Then, slowly, he took it. Because this wasn't just about the cafe, this was about becoming a better man. In the end, Carl didn't just change the cafe, he changed himself. And that was the greatest success of all. Through this story, we realize that power means nothing without integrity. Carl had once believed that respect came from authority, not kindness. But true leadership isn't about control, it's about compassion. John wasn't invisible, Samantha wasn't powerless, and Carl, he wasn't beyond redemption. Morgan Freeman didn't just fix a cafe, he restored the dignity of the people in it. Because in the end, it's not what you own or how much power you have. It's about how you choose to treat the people around you. A routine trip turned deadly. Until Morgan took control. The tour bus glided along the coastal road, the sun casting golden reflections on the ocean below. Everything was peaceful until the driver's body suddenly jerked, his hands slipping from the wheel. The bus lurched violently. Passengers screamed as it veered toward the edge of the cliff. And in that moment, only one man acted. Is courage the greatest power? Comment 1. Or is survival just blind luck? Comment 0. Morgan Freeman never expected to be in a life or death situation that day. He was just a passenger, traveling with his daughter Sophie, enjoying a scenic ride along the coast. But life doesn't send warnings before disaster strikes. It happens in an instant. 1 second, the driver was fine. The next, his hands jerked away from the wheel, his body slumping forward. A choked gasp escaped his lips before he went completely still. And that's when it happened. The bus lurched sharply to the right, veering toward the cliffside. Passengers screamed, grabbing onto their seats. Luggage tumbled from overhead compartments. Sophie's fingers dug into Morgan's arm, her breath ragged. "Dad, what's happening?" Morgan's pulse thundered in his ears. The driver was unresponsive. The bus was out of control, and the sharp curve ahead, it didn't lead to more road. It led to a sheer drop into the ocean below. Someone had to act. Now Morgan's body moved before his mind caught up. He lunged forward, pushing past panicked passengers. He didn't know if he could do it. Didn't know if he even had the strength. But he did know one thing. He had no choice. The cliff was getting closer. The screams were growing louder, and Morgan Freeman, he was their only chance at survival. The bus lurched wildly, its tires screeching against the pavement as it skidded closer to the cliff's edge. Inside, chaos erupted. Passengers screamed, some clutching onto the seats in front of them, others thrown sideways as the vehicle jolted. Luggage rained down from the overhead compartments, scattering across the floor. But Morgan Freeman? He didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in as he lunged forward, shoving past the panicked tourists. His heart pounded, his breath came in quick gasps. He hadn't moved this fast in years, but there was no time to think about that now. The only thing that mattered was getting to the driver's seat before it was too late. Morgan reached the front just as the bus veered dangerously close to the guardrail. Through the windshield, the view was terrifying. Nothing but jagged cliffs and the endless blue ocean below. The driver was still slumped over the wheel, his body limp, his face pale. Morgan didn't have time to check his pulse, didn't have time to process the sheer terror in Sophie's voice behind him. "Dad, do something!" Morgan grabbed the wheel with both hands and yanked it left hard. The bus groaned in protest, tires skidding as it jerked back toward the road, but the momentum was too strong, it was still going too fast. The engine roared, the weight of the vehicle pulling them toward disaster. Morgan slammed his foot onto the brake pedal. Nothing. The bus wasn't stopping. The guardrail was still too close. And then, a sickening snap. One of the front tires blew out. The entire vehicle shuddered violently. Morgan gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel tighter. "Come on, hold together." The road curved ahead, a sharp bend along the cliffside. If he didn't slow this thing down now, they were going over. Behind him, the screams only grew louder. Some passengers sobbed, clutching each other in fear. Others prayed under their breath, their hands trembling as they braced for the inevitable. Sophie gripped the back of his seat, her knuckles white. "Dad, please!" Morgan's mind raced. The brakes weren't working. The speed was too high. But he had one last option. Something he had seen once in an old action movie. Something crazy. Something desperate. He had to kill the engine manually. With one hand still gripping the wheel, Morgan reached toward the ignition, but the driver's body blocked it. He had to move him. Morgan gritted his teeth and used his shoulder to shove the unconscious man aside, freeing up enough space to reach the key. His fingers wrapped around it. The dashboard flashed with warning lights. "Come on, come on!" He twisted the key. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then with a final guttural choke, the engine cut off. The roaring stopped. The momentum didn't. But it was slowing. Sophie screamed as the bus skidded sideways. The tires screeched, sending sparks flying as the metal scraped against the pavement. Morgan fought the wheel, keeping it straight. One final turn. One last, desperate maneuver. The edge of the cliff was just meters away. Morgan could see the drop, could see the crashing waves below, could hear the terrified gasps of every soul on this bus. And then, the bus slammed to a stop. The force threw everyone forward. For several long, agonizing seconds, no one moved. Morgan's arms shook as he loosened his grip on the wheel. His breath came in ragged gasps. He had done it. The bus had stopped. They were alive, but barely. The front wheels were perched dangerously over the edge, just inches more, and they would have gone over. Morgan exhaled sharply, running a hand over his damp forehead. Then, a voice. Is he okay?" The driver. Morgan turned sharply. The man was still unconscious, but his chest was rising and falling. He was alive. Morgan's relief was short-lived because then Sophie let out a horrified gasp. "Dad, look!" Morgan followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. The guardrail behind them, it was bent, cracked. If they had gone just a little further, they wouldn't be having this conversation. They had survived this time. But the real question was, how long until fate tested them again? For a moment, the bus was silent. No more screams, No more chaos. Just the eerie, unsettling sound of labored breathing and the faint hum of wind outside. Morgan Freeman remained in the driver's seat, his grip on the wheel still tight as iron. He didn't dare move. The front wheels of the bus hung dangerously over the edge, the cracked guardrail just inches away from total collapse. If they had gone even a few feet further, they wouldn't be here right now. Behind him, passengers began to stir. A woman sobbed into her hands, clinging to her seat like it was the only thing keeping her alive. A man shook uncontrollably, his knuckles white from gripping the armrest. And Sophie, she was still frozen, her breath ragged as she stared out at the sheer drop beyond the windshield. "Dad," her voice wavered. "I know," Morgan cut in, his voice firm but calm. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, but his mind remained sharp. They weren't safe yet. He needed to act. Fast. Morgan turned his attention to the unconscious driver, still slumped in his seat. His chest was rising and falling, but his breathing was shallow, uneven. Morgan reached forward, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. "Sophie, call for help," Morgan ordered, his voice steady. She snapped out of her daze, fumbling for her phone. Yeah, okay." As she dialed, Morgan looked back at the passengers. "Is anyone here a doctor? A nurse?" Murmurs spread through the bus. Heads turned, then, "I'm a paramedic," a man near the back finally spoke. "Let me through." Morgan stepped aside as the paramedic crawled over scattered bags and broken glass, making his way to the front. He knelt beside the driver, fingers moving swiftly to assess him. Morgan watched, his mind calculating. The bus was precariously positioned. One wrong movement, too much weight shifting forward, and they could still go over. "We need to move, carefully," Morgan said, turning back to the passengers. Some of them nodded weakly. Others still looked too shocked to react. Morgan inhaled deeply, taking control. "Listen to me. We need to evacuate, but we have to do it in a way that keeps the weight off the front of the bus." He turned to the paramedic. "Can he be moved?" The paramedic hesitated, then nodded. "I'll need help supporting him, but yes, we can't risk him staying here any longer." Morgan turned to Sophie. "What's the update?" She pressed the phone to her ear. "Emergency services are on the way. They said to keep everyone calm and offload passengers from the back first." Morgan nodded. "Good, that's what we'll do." One by one, passengers began moving toward the rear exit. Each step shifted the weight of the bus, and every creak of the metal sent a chill down Morgan's spine. "Slowly," he warned. The last thing they needed was a sudden movement that tipped the balance. Sophie helped guide an elderly woman down the aisle, her hands steady despite the tension in her body. Morgan's eyes stayed locked on the front wheels, watching for any sign that the bus was shifting forward. The paramedic and another passenger lifted the driver carefully, working to move him toward safety. Morgan stayed behind, making sure he was the last one out, and then a sound that sent ice through his veins, a loud metallic groan. The bus jerked forward. Passengers screamed again. The weight distribution had shifted too suddenly. And now the bus was going over. In an instant, Morgan made his decision. There was no time to run, no time to jump. There was only one shot. As the bus tilted dangerously forward, Morgan lunged back toward the driver's seat. Gripping the wheel with all his strength, he planted his feet against the floor and pulled with everything he had. The back tires lifted. The front end tilted further over the cliff. For a split second, it felt like time had stopped. And then, with a deafening screech of metal and rubber, the bus stopped. Balanced, hanging, but still not falling. Morgan didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, a hand grabbed his arm. "Sophie." "Dad, we have to go. Now." He exhaled, gave one final glance at the abyss just inches from his feet. And finally, he let go of the wheel. Morgan and Sophie moved as quickly as they could, climbing out of the emergency exit as the rest of the passengers watched in stunned silence. Just as their feet hit solid ground, a sharp snap echoed behind them. Morgan turned just in time to see the guardrail give way, and the bus, the same one they had all just been inside, plummet down into the depths below. It hit the rocks below with a sickening crash, metal folding like paper, glass exploding into mist. The entire group stood frozen, watching the wreckage disappear beneath the waves. Then slowly, the reality of what had just happened set in. Sophie turned to Morgan, her voice shaking. "If you hadn't been here..." Morgan met her gaze, his own heartbeat finally slowing. "But I was," she exhaled, stepping closer. "You saved everyone today." Morgan didn't answer. Instead, he turned to look back at the road ahead, because he knew this wasn't over yet. The bus was gone, the passengers were safe, but something about this whole situation didn't sit right, and Morgan was about to find out why. The wreckage of the bus lay crumpled below, half submerged in the waves. Passengers stood in stunned silence, watching the remains of what could have been their final moments sink into the ocean. The sound of emergency sirens finally pierced the air, flashing lights appearing in the distance. But for Morgan Freeman, something wasn't right. He should have felt relief. He had saved everyone. Yet deep in his gut, there was a nagging feeling, an unanswered question. This wasn't just an accident. Something didn't add up. And Morgan Freeman, he didn't ignore his instincts. As paramedics rushed toward the passengers checking for injuries, Morgan turned back to the scene. The road, the skid marks, the guardrail. It had given way too easily. Morgan narrowed his eyes, stepping toward the broken metal. He reached down, brushing his fingers along the snapped section, and froze. It wasn't just broken. It had been cut. Not by the bus, not by force, but deliberately. His breath hitched. Someone had tampered with the guardrail, which meant this wasn't just an accident. Morgan turned, searching for the bus driver among the chaos. He spotted him lying on a stretcher, an oxygen mask over his face as paramedics worked. Morgan approached swiftly. "How is he?" he asked the paramedic. "Severe distress," the medic replied. "We're taking him to the hospital now. But whatever happened, it hit fast. Sudden collapse, loss of breath, full body paralysis for a few minutes." Morgan's jaw tightened. That wasn't just a heart attack. "Could it have been poison?" he asked sharply. The medic hesitated. "It's not impossible, but we won't know until the tests come back." Morgan exhaled slowly. His mind raced. This wasn't just a mechanical failure. Someone had tried to kill them, and if the driver was poisoned, that meant someone had wanted the entire bus to go over the edge. Morgan turned back to the passengers. Sophie stood nearby, hugging herself, still shaken. Other passengers were crying, talking to police, trying to process the near-death experience. But one man stood off to the side. A middle-aged man, dressed too well for a simple bus tour, sunglasses, expensive watch. He looked too calm, too composed. Morgan had spent decades reading people, and something about this man was off. Morgan stepped toward him. "Quite the situation, isn't it?" he said casually. The man turned. Behind the sunglasses, Morgan sensed calculating eyes. "Tragic," the man agreed. "You don't seem too shaken up," Morgan observed. The man shrugged. "I've seen worse." Morgan's jaw clenched. "Who are you?" A pause. "Just a traveler." Morgan knew when someone was lying, and this man was definitely lying. Before Morgan could press further, two black SUVs appeared. The doors swung open and a group of men in suits stepped out. They moved quickly, heading straight for the mystery man. One of them spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Sir, we need to go." Morgan's eyes narrowed. Who the hell was this guy? And why did he have a private security team? The man turned back to Morgan. "Looks like my ride's here. Stay safe, Mr. Freeman." Then, just like that, he was gone. Morgan watched as the SUVs sped away, and in his gut, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Morgan turned back to Sophie, his thoughts racing. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked. Morgan exhaled. "That wasn't just some passenger, Sophie, and this wasn't just an accident." Her eyes widened. "What are you saying?" Morgan looked at the shattered guardrail, the wrecked bus below, and the disappearing SUVs in the distance. Then he met Sophie's gaze. Someone wanted us dead. The crash wasn't just a freak accident, someone had planned it. But why? And who was the man in the suit? Morgan was about to find out whether he wanted to or not. Morgan Freeman had spent a lifetime portraying characters who unraveled mysteries, exposed corruption, and faced danger head-on. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. And right now, he was standing in the wreckage of what should have been an innocent road trip. Except it wasn't. The bus crash had been deliberate. The driver's sudden collapse, too suspicious. The weakened guardrail, too perfectly placed. And then there was the mysterious man in the suit, the one who had walked away unscathed, flanked by private security. Morgan's gut told him something bigger was at play, and he needed to find out what, before it was too late. The next stop was the hospital, where the driver had been rushed for emergency care. Sophie sat beside her father in the waiting room, still shaken. "Dad, what if you hadn't been there?" she whispered. Morgan placed a steady hand on hers. "But I was," he said simply. Her fingers tightened. "Yeah, but what if this happens again? What if—" Before she could finish, a doctor approached. "Mr. Freeman?" Morgan stood. "How's the driver?" The doctor exhaled. "He's stable now, but the cause of his collapse, it wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't natural at all." Sophie's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated before speaking. "We found traces of a neurotoxin in his bloodstream, something designed to paralyze, to shut down the body, slowly. If he hadn't collapsed when he did, he would have lost control completely in a few more minutes." Morgan's stomach tightened. So he had been right. The crash was planned. Someone had wanted that bus off the cliff, but who? And why? Before he could ask another question, a commotion erupted down the hall. A group of nurses and security guards ran past, their voices urgent. "He's gone!" one of them yelled. Morgan's instincts flared. "Who's gone?" he demanded. The doctor turned, his face pale. "The driver," he said. He disappeared." Morgan froze. "What do you mean disappeared?" "Someone took him, right from his hospital bed. The cameras went black for exactly 2 minutes. When the power came back, he was gone." Morgan clenched his jaw. Someone had made sure the driver never talked. And now, they were covering their tracks. Morgan turned back to Sophie. "We need to move. Now." Before she could respond, the automatic doors of the hospital slid open, and in walked the last person Morgan wanted to see. The man in the suit. The same man from the bus. The one who had left in a fleet of black SUVs right after the crash. Only this time, he wasn't alone. A security team followed him, surrounding him like a fortress. His gaze locked onto Morgan's, and then he smiled, like he knew something Morgan didn't, like he had already won. The driver was missing. The enemy had returned. And Morgan, he was about to learn the real reason why that bus was never supposed to make it to its destination. The hospital room had fallen silent. The man in the suit, the orchestrator behind the bus crash, stood before Morgan, his once confident demeanor shaken. He had spent his life controlling outcomes, pulling strings behind the scenes. But today he had lost. Because Morgan Freeman didn't just survive. He uncovered everything. The plot, the poisoned driver, the cut guardrail. And the truth? The crash had never been random. It had been a message. But now the sender was exposed. Morgan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You thought you could decide who lived and who didn't." The man lowered his gaze, his shoulders tense. "You thought no one would question it." A deep breath. Then, for the first time, true regret in his eyes. "I was wrong," the man finally admitted. Morgan studied him for a long moment, then he nodded. "Yes, you were." Sophie stood beside her father, watching as the authorities led the man away. "Dad, do you think he'll change?" she asked. Morgan exhaled. "That's up to him, because redemption isn't given, it's earned, and some people, they never take that chance. But Morgan, he had done his part. He had saved lives, exposed a hidden truth, and reminded the world of one simple fact. A single act of courage can change everything. Morgan had fought fate and won, but sometimes the hardest battles aren't against villains. They're against the choices we make within ourselves. Through this story, we realize that power means nothing if used without conscience. The true mark of a leader isn't their wealth, their status, or their ability to control, it's their ability to protect. Morgan Freeman didn't seek to be a hero, but in the face of disaster, he became one. Because in the end, it's not about how much power you hold, it's about how you use it. And the greatest power of all? The courage to do what's right no matter the cost.